All right. Recording in progress. Got it. Okay. Well, welcome everyone again to another weekly presentation and discussion in the Almanac series sessions of talks. And tonight, as you know, we have the title presentation Deity, Transcendent and Immanent. And most of you have on your email invite this little uh, beautiful invitation to the presentation, and there's a quote from Plotinus there that says, "When we look outside of that on which we depend, we ignore our unity. Looking outward, we see many faces. Look inward, and all is the one head." And that then brings us to a few points that have to be presented before the actual talk. And one of these has to do with themes for reflections over the next 4 weeks. It's typical that these titles are presented so that you can kind of keep them in mind and also think about them in terms of how they relate to what we've just passed in terms of the last few weeks, what we've got tonight, and what is coming up moving forward. So January 21st, we have the talk That Thou Art. And clearly there is a relationship between deity, transcendent and immanent, and that issue. One appears to be outward, the other appears to be inward, but then we have what Plotinus just brought to our attention, and that indicates the oneness. January 28th, we have the bridge, and that could be interpreted in many, many different ways, especially the Antaskarana bridge. But either way, it appears to point towards that which connects us to something. The third is the 4th of February, and that is initiation and immortality. And the first and last thing that we should always keep in mind, as has been presented, is that the teachings have nothing to do but with the universality, the one life, that human brother and sisterhood, and the nature of immortality, which we all partake of. And so clearly that would be a wonderful presentation in terms of helping us recognize that immortality here and now. The fourth in the series, February 11th, is Law, Cosmic and Human. And we can only hope that after we recognize that immortality through proper initiation, that we become the law in action, cosmically and humanly, in regards to how we treat each other. Now, the Almanac series, as it relates to tonight's talk, Deity, Transcendent and Immanent, is also connected with a series of little calendar sayings. And although we won't read them all, the challenge as we listen to tonight's talk is to listen closely to the presentation, but also reflect on some of these sayings to see if in fact they ring true to you. Do they fall short of what they are intending to guide you to? Or perhaps could they be wrong? Interesting to challenge ourselves with. And in that regards, let me just point out one or two of these. And this first one by Ibn Arabi is beautiful, but questionable. If you affirm only his transcendence, you restrict him. And if you affirm only his eminence, you limit him. If you maintain both aspects, you are exempt from error, and immanent, and a master in the spiritual sciences. Now that is a lot, but is that all? Then there's this little short one by Martin Luther King. Faith is the opening of all sides and every level of one's life to the divine inflow. And clearly that is an inundation of tremendous spiritual light to each and every being. But is that all? And then one more. The bird is beyond seeking, yet it is most clearly visible. The formless is in the midst of forms. I sing the glory of forms. And that is by Kabir. And then we would say, is that all? So on that note, we have someone that is going to present some wonderful ideas to us tonight. Shobha, we are turning it over to you. Deity, Transcendent and Immanent.
Thank you. Thank you, Eugene. What a beautiful connection that we saw between all the different pieces that are following mine. Don't get fooled by my name. It's just like Plotinus's quote. There are many forms, but the person is finally the same, huh?
Mhm.
So let's talk about this topic by first imagining a scene or two scenes. First scene, you're in Britain and Gaul several centuries back. A group of initiates or seers, they have no statues or idols to worship. They were called Druids and were connected in their esoteric hidden teaching with the universal wisdom religion. Their deity was formless, and the initiates included women. Contrast this picture with the world of churches and temples, for example. While churches may not have any idols or statues, the message generally is about a God who rewards the good deeds and punishes the wicked deeds of humans. Meanwhile, in the temples, especially the ones that I grew up with, the Hindu temples, the priests, all male, delight in adorning and decorating the idols and reciting the mantras in Sanskrit, while the worshippers sing the praises of the gods and pray to them. These two scenes illustrate how the God idea is seen in different ways. I'm just sticking to two ways, but there are many ways. But what we see here is that the former is unspeakable and beyond ordinary expression, while the latter scene appears as an anthropomorphic form. The title of today's discussion somewhat reflects the understanding of God or deity in this twofold way, immanent and transcendent. So I went to the dictionary to look at these words just to make sure I get them right. Immanent is defined in the dictionary as restricted entirely to the mind, being subjective, limited in activity, and being within the limits of possible experience or knowledge. Transcendent, on the other hand, means that it surpasses and is beyond the limits of ordinary experience, comprehension, and beyond material existence. These definitions are pretty useful in understanding the two scenes that I painted. We can now surmise that the first picture closely resembles transcendence, and the second is that of immanence. Now, the concept of inside and outside is seen in many cultures and many languages. I'm going to stick to my native language, Tamil, from South India, where I shall talk about two words that are used a lot and discussed a lot, not only in the literal sense, but also in the literary sense. I'm going to give you an example of in the literal sense of these two words. And I'm going to start with an example of a house, an old Tamil house that may not even exist today, but existed during the time of my father. And if anybody has gone to see Ramanujan's house in South India, which is in a city called Kumbakonam, it reflects this idea very clearly. The outside and the inside. The outside is called Puram in my language, where one entertains friends, mostly the male friends of the male members of the family. The inside part of the house is called the Agam, and it is reserved for the family and the place where the mostly females are cooking. In a literary sense, this is also seen in Tamil stories, where the outer meaning is called Puram and the inner meaning is called Agam. So appearances are always deceptive. There is a wonderful little book that came out a few years ago from Bangalore by a writer who writes in Kannada, a different language, and it was translated into English. And I think the name in English was Gachar Gochar. If any of you get a chance to read it, it illustrates the inner and the outer beautifully. Now let's go back to the God idea that we started with, because it's all about the God idea or deity. And we know that H.P. Blavatsky says, right in the preface of the Isis Unveiled, page 2, when years ago we first traveled over the East, exploring the penetralia, which is the innermost parts of its deserted sanctuaries, two saddening and ever recurring questions oppressed our thoughts. Where, who, what is God? Whoever saw the individual spirit of man so as to be able to assure himself of man's immortality? It was while most anxious to solve these perplexing problems that we came into contact with certain men endowed with such mysterious powers and such profound knowledge that we may truly designate them as the sages of the Orient. To their instructions, we lent a ready ear. They showed us that by combining science with religion, the existence of God and immortality of man's spirit may be demonstrated like a problem of Euclid. And if any of us have read the Isis, we can see how she spends the first half of it talking and arguing and expounding the opinions of scientists and contrasting it with the ancient wisdom religion. And the second part where she talks with theologians, talks about theologians' words and contrasts what ancient wisdom talks about. So here, the tension between immanence and transcendence is seen in the quest for understanding how we approach deity. Alexander the Great was told he could conquer the world if he untied the Gordian knot in present-day Anatolia, which I believe is in Turkey. When he could not untie it, legend has it that he cut it. The question that H.P. Blavatsky poses requires a lifetime of thinking and trying to understand the underlying idea of true divinity. However, when one cuts the Gordian knot, instead of unraveling it little by little, it short circuits the process and leads usually to immanent understanding. Let us examine this a little more by remembering that one of the definitions of immanence is subjective understanding using the mind. I immediately have to go to the voice of the silence, pages 1 and 2, which states, having become indifferent to objects of perception, the pupil must seek out the Raja of the senses, the thought producer, he who awakes illusion. The mind is the great slayer of the real. Let the disciples slay the slayer. How many times have we read this? But how important it is that the voice of the silence lays it out right at the beginning. So it tells us not to depend too much on this mind of ours. Clearly, we see that limitation of the mind in going beyond the immanent level. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras takes us step by step to understand the modifications of the mind and how to control it. Other clues and hints are thrown our way in all our theosophic literature. And I'm going to focus on the secret doctrine and start with the proem portion in the Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, page 14, where A talks about the first fundamental, where deity is no longer immanent but transcendent, an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception and could only be dwarfed by any human expression or similitude. It is beyond the range and reach of thought. In the words of Mandukya, the Mandukya Upanishads, unthinkable and unspeakable. Then, after trying to write about something you cannot really write about, she says, to render these ideas clearer to the general reader, let him set out with the postulate that there is one absolute reality which antecedes all manifested conditioned being. Many of us have read and presented about the first fundamental in our time in theosophy, even though in the first paragraph she calls the absolute unspeakable and unthinkable. Further on, she talks about the motion aspect of the one reality, which is also symbolized by the great breath. This is almost like the heartbeat, the pulsation. Throughout the Secret Doctrine, as in the Isis Unveiled, H.P. Blavatsky repeats the notion of deity according to ancient accumulated wisdom, or we could call it secret doctrine or theosophy, but adds little nuggets of wisdom and insight that help us expand the idea of deity. Even though there are a lot of references from these pages that I'm going to refer to, I find it important for us to ponder over them, and I beg your indulgence. I'm especially talking about the summing up portion of the Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, pages 281 onwards. And I shall start with a quote from page 281, where she starts with the different points to summarize. And she starts with number 1. The Secret Doctrine teaches no atheism except in the Hindu sense of the word, Nastika, or the rejection of idols, including every anthropomorphic god. In this sense, every occultist is a Nastika. 2, it admits a logos or a collective creator of the universe, a demiurgos, in the sense implied when one speaks of an architect as the center of an edifice, whereas that architect has never touched one stone of it, but while furnishing the plan, left all the manual labor to the masons. In our case, the plan was furnished by the ideation of the universe, and the constructive labor was left to the Dhyan Chohans, or the intelligent powers. But the demiurgos is no personal deity, and an imperfect extra-cosmic God, nor an imperfect extra-cosmic God, but only the Dhyan Chohans and the other forces. Then I shall jump to number 5. The universe was evolved out of its ideal plan, upheld through eternity in in the unconsciousness of that which the Vedantins call Parabrahma. While the Vedantins call it Parabrahma, this is the first fundamental proposition in theosophy, talking about the omnipresent principle. On page 282, she continues the idea of the omnipresent principle, saying, the perpetual motion of the great breath only awakens cosmos at the dawn of our new period, setting into motion by the two contrary forces, and thus causing it to become objective on the plane of illusion. In the footnote, she explains the contrary forces by saying that they are the centripetal and the centrifugal forces, which are male and female, positive and negative. In other words, duality pervades in the conditioned universe. How do we touch that which is transcendent? The following words from the Divine Pymander, Book 9, verse 64 expresses it best, and it also appears in the pages that follow 282 in the Secret Doctrine. God is not a mind, but the cause that the mind is. Not a spirit, but the cause that the spirit is. Not light, but the cause that the light is. Divinity is everywhere. Yet we need to comprehend that reality is not here upon the earth. This conundrum leads some to hold on to form to revere, and others to say that all is Maya, but the one reality. Neither course alone takes us to the other shore. Since right now, in this round and globe, we have to live, breathe, and suffer, and maybe enjoy right here on earth. Somewhere in all this, the great initiates got it right by reminding us to live here on earth and not be attached to it, holding on to wisdom, compassion, and love of all to guide us. I'm going to repeat what Eugene read from Ibn al-Arabi because it completely embodies what I'm trying to say. If you affirm only his transcendence, you restrict him. And if you affirm only his immanence, you limit him. If you maintain both aspects, you are exempt from error. An imam and a master in the spiritual sciences. Thank you. I'm making this short because there's so much I'd like to learn from all of you. Thank you.
Got it. Okay. Thank you, Shobha. That was perfect and deific in its expressions, and if we listen carefully, it pointed to many degrees of understanding of that term deity. many levels of awakening that people mistake as the ultimate level of deity. And yet we are being inspired to see even beyond that. And again, ending up with that quote from Ibn Arabi is just a work of art in and of itself. And yet we would question, is it complete? And on that note, we have time for questions and answers, and we'll shovel them back and forth between Shoba and myself. But Shoba, I think Judy has one for you. Her hand is up. Judy?
Sure.
Uh, yes.
Judy.
Thank you, Shoba. For some reason on the screen it shows your name being Lauren, which I guess is a mistake because I know who you are. But well, there are two things that I've always wondered about in this, which is becoming deeper with me all the time. That whatever began this universe has no beginning and no end. It's like Spinoza's self-caused substance, which I cannot comprehend, as Spinoza would say, finite mode. But how can we make sense of life? I know that the philosopher Kant tried to deal with the transcendent and the transcendental, and he said that God was a transcendent idea. We can't know anything about God, and yet he also kind of limited God by being a Puritan. He was, by saying that a transcendental argument for God's existence would be that we have to have a reward and punishment to make meaning, but it's meaningless to try to comprehend if the cosmos is infinite or finite. We can't go there. So how can we, as such limited beings, really understand what this ultimate being is, and is it important that we do so? I think it is important, and yet we have to live on this earth and not be earthly, as you said. The cat wants to know too.
Yeah. I wish there were an easy way of responding to this, because one of the things I keep hearkening back to is that our speech itself is limited, right? So the words like understanding, comprehending, all that also imply we are trying to use this mind. And then the voice of the silence and Patanjali and H.P. Blavatsky, all of us tell us to go beyond the mind, right? So there is this constant contradiction and conundrum within us. But one of the things that H.P. Blavatsky, William Conjudge, all of those who have given us these texts have told us is, first of all, we need to study, right? We need to study our books. And one of the things I've realized reading The Secret Doctrine is I can keep reading it, and every time I read that page, it shows me something different. So what is it that we need to do? We need to awaken our intuition. We were born with certain qualities that we have atrophied or almost atrophied, and we need to awaken those in us. And all that we can do is read our devotional texts for guidance. We can read our books for guidance and just keep struggling on. So how do we comprehend? I think one of the most beautiful things that I find is when I look at the Buddha's life and the way he was kept away from everything, and suddenly, when he saw suffering, he realized he needed to go find out. So I think we need to acknowledge one of the first things that Buddha's Four Noble Truths talks about is that sorrow it's part of life. But then we also understand there's enjoyment and pleasure too. And then we remember what H.P. Blavatsky says, that duality pervades in where we live. So what does that mean? It gives us a hint that we need to go beyond it. And how do we go beyond it? It's a series of lifetime struggles, right, Judy? It's a series of lifetime struggles. Maybe we started something earlier that we are all fortunate enough to talk about. But we also need to remember something. We don't have to feel arrogant and proud that we own the truth. There are many people outside the theosophical fold who are saying some amazing stuff that we need to listen to, right? So I think it is a question of, I always think about compassion and understanding and willingness to hear, right? A willingness to listen, you know, and learn, but keeping certain things as anchors as we do this, right? Yes, there is a lot in our philosophy, but we can read others too and learn from them. Um, Using the anchor of compassion and seeing if it aligns with what we have already studied in our books. So I don't have an easy answer for this, Judy, but all I can say is it's a series of lifetime struggles. Maybe Eugene has something to add.
Thank you.
Well,
All right.
again, thank you, Shobha, for that. Because again, it does sum up a very unique position based on the question that Judy presented. And one of the things that I found interesting about the question was that the assumption was made that we are limited beings. And as you've already said, the voice tells us that the mind is the slayer of the real. And so we have become not only blinded to the truth of our immortality, but we have also become attached to a dualistic and relativistic worldview that is not true. It is relatively true, but we forget that we can change channels. And when we reawaken to the fact by any means, if you want to take 1,000 lives, that's fine. If you want to do it in 7 lives, that's fine. But when we reawaken, we come to a point, and I just have to read this because I read it a couple of hours before tonight's meeting, and I thought, wow, it should be apropos, and this question really brings it into point. And it's from the Lankavatara Sutra. And it starts out the chapter on self-realization. And one of the disciples is asking the Buddha, pray tell us, blessed one, what is the nature of self-realization by reason of which we shall be able to attain transcendental intelligence? And transcendental intelligence is the same as what we're talking about directly, but very close. And the blessed one replied, transcendental intelligence rises when the intellectual mind reaches its limit. Mind is the slayer of the real. And if things are to be realized in their true and essence nature, its processes of mentation, which are based on particularized ideas, discriminations, judgments, must be transcended by an appeal to some higher faculty of cognition, if there be such a higher faculty. There is such a faculty in the intuitive mind, which, as we have seen, is the link between the intellectual mind and universal mind. And still, universal mind is not that absolute that we're talking about, but close. While it is not an individualized organ like the intellectual mind, it has that which is much better, direct dependence upon universal mind. While intuition does not give information that can be analyzed and discriminated, it gives that which is far superior, self-realization through identification. And so that is clearly something, again, from the words of the Buddha, that we should ponder along with tonight's subject, because if we always think we're limited, if we always think we're these bodies, if we always think that this cognitive brain mind that we use to negotiate discriminations is it, we're just stuck to the wheel. If we work to go beyond that, we're loosening ourselves from those attachments and the wheel, not to get away, but to be liberated while we serve. Monica, your hand is up.
Thank you. This was wonderful, Shobha. Such a good presentation. I had two questions. One is, I could not remember the name of the book that you said describes the inner and the outer so well. Could you tell me that again?
Yeah, I'll put it on the chat. I wish I could remember his name. He wrote it in his native language, but it's called, I'll write it down in the chat. It's called Gachar Gochar. Sounds really weird. It just means it's a tangle and a mess. That's what it means, that word. But it's a word that's used in some of our languages. But doesn't the word look kind of, I mean, what is the word? Is that onotomo? What is that word where the word itself describes what it is? For example, the word apt is so apt, isn't it? APT. It's so beautifully sung. So this word gachar gochar itself describes what it is, and it's a mess. It's a tangle, but it's beautiful. I'm not going to tell you the story. You've got to read it and figure it out. But I mean, this whole thing about the inner and the outer meaning is so beautifully illustrated. Some people who read it are like, what? What happened? But you can surmise it. So I'm going to give you the name. It's worth reading. It was given an amazing review in, I think, the New York, not the New York Review of Books, but the London Review of Books, I think. So I'm going to give you the name.
Thank you. Okay, so the other question I had was, in terms of the immanent aspect of deity.
Yes.
I'm wondering about the idea of idolatry. Are we able to do away with, is idolatry part of our evolutionary process? And if so, is intuition, is it possible to have an active present connection with intuition and still somehow be involved with idolatry? And I ask this because in Wednesday Ocean of Theosophy class, we were just finishing a chapter where Mr. Judge talks about the end of dogmatism. And it was the first time this student's mind was getting that that's part of an evolutionary cycle. So in terms of the idea of idolatry and intuition and immanence and our view of these things, could you say something about that?
Sure, I'll try. Idolatry. I can see that. I grew up going to temples and from early on, because I was in Theosophy, we didn't pray, but to me it was an architectural marvel. So that's how I looked at it. But I do remember seeing all the, one of the things they do in the temples is they bathe the gods with different things. They first bathe it with milk and then oil and then honey and all of that. Yes, I mean, on one level, when I was growing up, I said, what is all this madness? First of all, they're wasting all this. Why are they doing it? But I think it was their way of singing the praises, saying, I need to revere you, right? Now I look at it differently. Then there's another thing they do. There's something called Vishnu Sahasranama.
Yes.
Sahas means thousand. Nama means name. It's very close to the English word, Nam. And then what do? They have these, so people get together in groups all over the world, Indians, and they repeat the Lord's name, Vishnu's name in 1,000 ways. Now, that's very literal. But maybe out of this, you can see, wow, how many different ways can you look at the concept of deity, right?
Mhm.
And H.P. Vatsky does that in the first fundamental. She shows how you can look at it in different ways. She calls it motion. She calls it the great breath. 1,000 names, you could have 1,000 names. So, and then look at people like Mirabai and Andal that I talked about last year.
Yeah.
They were talking about Krishna and they were singing the praises of Krishna. Idolatry? Maybe. But at the same time, they reached enlightenment, they understood because they could see something more than just the picture and the idol. So, one of the things I have learned over the years, I think I've evolved a little to appreciate people who worship idols and not dismiss them. Because there are 1,000 ways in which you can reach the Lord. In fact, that's said somewhere in maybe in the Upanishads or somewhere. 1,000 ways of reaching the Lord. Theosophy is one way. Maybe through idolatry you can go there. Why not? Because many people, you remember how hordes of invaders tried to destroy all this. One of the most amazing things in Spain is because the Moors were there, the Muslims came. They had written all over in their in Arabic, Allah is great, Allah is God, everywhere. The others who came after them, who called them, called them like invaders and didn't care for their religion, didn't even know what was being said. But the point is, Allah is everywhere. God is everywhere. Vishnu is everywhere. The word Vish means to pervade, right?
Yeah.
So if we take it in the sense that H.P. Blavatsky talks about in those pages after she talks about cosmogenesis, after the summing up, she talks about all this. We get a new vision of what was meant. When the ancients worshipped the sun,
Mhm.
what an amazing thing, because H.P. Blavatsky talks about the spiritual sun, right? So I think there is meaning to all this if you don't take the dead letter.
Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you. And clearly, we could refer this. I think this was a quote from HPB in the calendar. Monday, Tuesday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, one of those days, but it says all that which is found upon the earth has its spiritual counterpart on high. That was from the Zohar. And then HPB, as above, so it is below, as in heaven, so on earth. So if we really, and I would put a question mark after not the definition of immanence from the perspective of the dictionary, but the definition of eminence from the perspective of the awakened. When we can understand what eminence is, although individuals may be attached to the appearance of the idol, what is really in the world of relativity an idol? What is really the reality? And if there is nothing but the one life, does it really matter how we picture it? What really matters is how we relate as it with each other. And then that other reading that points out the second, I sense one flame, O Guru Deva. I see countless undetached sparks, undetached from each other, undetached from the flame, undetached from appearance, shining in it. One life, one motion, one breath, one pulse, as Shobha said. And in that question about judge and dogma, we can go right back to the beginning of Shobha's talk when she said there were the adepts talking about the truth or the absolute. without the temples, without the images, without the idols, without the forms.
Wow.
And then there were those that had the temples. Each serves a purpose. And given that for those of us stuck in relativity, we have to approach truth from where we are, idols may be the exact thing that's necessary at any particular time. And each one has them anyway, whether it's a statue of Jesus Christ, whether it's a symbolic image of that which is boundless. That's an idol too, until you can discard it and be present. And to appreciate that, to discard and be present, indicates that it's already beyond whether you think you can or you can't. But Robert, your hand is up.
Yes. Thank you, Shobha. It's like gleams of diamonds that you're throwing out at us. So we very much appreciate those clear perceptions. HPB, I can't remember, and perhaps you do, somewhere says that that people often jump to a condition of blankness, trying to get to the transcendent absolute, and they ignore those metaphysical abstractions which give rise to the universe. So this reminds me of a contrast between manifest and unmanifest. But at a very high level, that is. And you could see, in some sense, it seems like you've kind of answered the question already. But I wondered if you had any thoughts about what it means to ignore it or not ignore those metaphysical abstractions which give rise to the universe.
Yeah, it's this whole thing about the tension between the immanence. That's why I said the tension between immanence and transcendence. When I started out, I was saying, these are two distinct things. Not really. They're all connected. So, think about, all the saints and mystics over the centuries that we are familiar with. Eugene just did a quote from Kabir, a famous poet from India. His couplets were famous. But there is also this thing about let's not be carried away without, that's why we talk about wisdom, talk about study, because blindness can come easily. One of the things I remember Eugene saying right in the beginning when I first started coming for these Zoom classes is, we make these models and then we have to discard them and make another one, discard it and make it again. I thought that was almost like what H.P. Blavatsky says on page 40 of The Secret Doctrine, at the top of page 40, where she talks about a series of progressive awakenings. You never do reach the mountaintop. You are still ascending, right? And then you see something there and you say, wow, this is amazing. Here, this rock formation or something. But then you go higher and say, no, that wasn't right. I need to look a little deeper. So that's the thing. We can't be blind to all this and think we know. One of the, I think of this actress, Shirley MacLaine, who thought this was spiritual, talking about the psychic, right? And then I think about the Isis Unveiled, where H.P. Blavatsky spends the whole thing talking about the triune nature of man. She starts with the simplest in the Isis. And that was such an awakening for me when, as a young girl of maybe 12 or 13, I had to say the 10 propositions of psychology. And I was so excited by the word. There is no magic. There is only law. There is no miracle. Oh my God, that's amazing. Mm-hmm. But that's what I mean. If little children could be told when they look at an experiment in chemistry, it's not magic. It's just the interaction of chemicals. It's the same thing. When you see, there used to be a famous a guy called David Copperfield who used to levitate over the Grand Canyon. And it's like, oh my God, how did he do it? Of course, there was always that other side who said it was mass hypnotism, right? People who said it's all mass hypnotism. How did he even achieve mass hypnotism? And so H.P. Blavatsky in Isis Unveiled so beautifully talks about it, page after page after page, explaining it, and talking about the difference between a medium, a sorcerer, an adept, and all that. And, she clarifies it for us. So when people in India walk over coals or have a vision, people say there's actually a word in Tamil that says, God descended upon them. God didn't descend upon them. We as students of yours, we know it's a psychic vision, which is not spiritual. So I think blindness and all needs to be like cobwebs in our head, need to be constantly cleaned up. And as students of theosophy, we have a lot of cobwebs still. I know I have a lot. But the very fact that we know we have that helps us move on to a certain extent.
Great, thank you. And let's just add on to that. I mean, I want to read another one of these sayings from the calendar, but also if we go straight to the emptiness, can we ever appreciate the diverse? We can never talk about laws because attaching ourselves to the emptiness and calling it emptiness means that we don't understand what emptiness is. And so we can read this one. This was, I guess, the last day, Saturday, on the calendar, Friday or Saturday. And it says, by again, Plotinus, to bring this cosmos into being, the all-so first laid aside its eternity and clothed itself with time. So in order to appreciate true emptiness, which is that plenum and fullness that HPB talks about in the SG, we must know the clothed aspect of cosmos and its laws. And there is another expression here in the calendar that points to that. We can't have one without the other, and then we have to transcend both, which is the question of, when we think we have emptiness, do we really have it? Obviously not. And therein lies the deity, the transcendence, the immanence, and that which embraces all of those concepts. Yes, Dave, your hand is up.
Yes, we were talking about idols earlier, and we see these forms and all, as religious expression in the various religions and things like that. And I guess we all have our secular idols too. Could we think of idols, not something we have to get beyond, but that they are vessels actually of the absolute? If deity is in everything, I don't think we have to run away from these things as much as penetrate them. Maybe that's what poets do so beautifully. We've quoted him many times. You can't think of Blake's beautiful comments about to see the world in a grain of sand, heaven in a wildflower, on and on. That I don't know if I have trouble with this idea of emptiness. To me, it's a little misleading in some ways. I mean, maybe you could comment on some, on vessels and emptiness. Yeah.
I think here's the thing. Limited as we are right now with what we are using, we're actually using this mind, right? The great slayer of the real, and trying to. I think the idol shouldn't become a crutch. The idol should be something we use to understand. I remember, when I look at an idol of Shiva or Vishnu and the things they hold in their hands, everything has a meaning.
Alright.
In fact, there is something that blocks the entrance to Shiva's temple. And that can be interpreted in so many ways. It could be the material, it could be the physical, it could be the transitory. We could look at it like symbols. The problem is we take an idol and we take everything literally. But if we were to take it more in the sense of what it symbolizes, one of the things we have in India with the Hindu gods is every god has a vehicle that they use, and it's and now we also know it's called the upadhi. So we need to go to that. Look at all the divisions of the body as karanopadhi. One is the vehicle of the other, the linga sharira compared to the physical body. What is the connection between it? So if we were to look at it like that, it makes sense. But the problem is the vehicle becomes objectified. For example, Shiva's son, Subramanya, who's also called Murugan, the peacock is his vehicle, So every time you see a picture of Subramanya or Murugan or Kartikeya, which is also his other name, you think of the peacock, because that's how I grew up. I grew up seeing these pictures. So again, picture of Jesus. We've seen all these paintings, and so we think he's a Anglo-Saxon with blue eyes. But actually, he grew up in a place called Palestine, where most people are not blue-eyed and blonde. So again, not only the physical appearance, not the real one, but it also limits us in understanding. So we need to go beyond. And then there was another piece to your question. I'm sorry, I forgot that. What was that, David?
No, I was just thinking that these form is the way in. It's what you say too. We're very materialistic in our view of things. That's how we've been, as a culture. But there is a, there are keys in the, like you were saying, in the forms. We can use them as doorways. Let's put it that way, as passages rather than just reject them. Right.
That's the whole point. I don't want to worship and make them revere them, but I also want to say, wow, the symbology is interesting. So when Shiva is stepping on the demon, one of the interpretations is suppress your lower desires, psychic and noetic action. That's what it is. That whole article on theosophical that H.V. Blavatsky wrote. So I think we need to look at it like that, and then we go somewhere. But it doesn't mean we completely reject it, nor do we completely embrace it. Get what we need to move on.
Also, if I might just add, I just thought of this one other thought along this line is, images are a language too. We drown in words, but images, touch another side of our being often and can penetrate and communicate that where words don't. We get, like you were saying, get beyond the intellectual.
Absolutely, like looking at an artist's work, pictures say 1,000 things to each one.
Right.
So I think that's what it is. We see something, right? When we look at art, even when I listen to music, I see images. You can see images when you listen to music that touches you in a different way. So I think, yes, art, poetry, any kind of they do take us to different heights.
Yeah.
But then what is my question?
Right.
And that's a beautiful point, because again, this whole idea of deity, put it in quotes, as you mentioned, the understanding and the meaning. And if you ask each one, there will be difference. unless one can embrace all understanding and all meaning. And so, in a sense, whatever level we are at, whatever grade we are at, that is the way that we will approach. But again, the teachings, I mean, even starting out, again, I love the way you opened up the talk with the sages and their discussion, because if we're using words to discriminate, if we're pointing at signs and images, we're missing the inner truth. And yet we may need, as David said, those images, those forms, those colors, those senses, those sounds to guide us along the way. And, you know, even though it's not necessarily something that HPB said, there was a spiritual presence that said that all of these methods of approach are inferior, but they are necessary for those that assume an inferior position. And when we come to realize what we are, and you know, Dave said he has a difficult time with the word emptiness, then don't use the word emptiness. I mean, no word is going to be adequate. No sound is going to be adequate. No motion that we use as the discriminating factor is going to be the right motion. And yet there is something very potent that is present. And again, let's go back to the calendar and let's read from Halak. He is hidden in his manifestation and manifest in his concealing. Again, these are, you know, on the little calendar that comes out. Beautiful readings, beautiful things to really ponder, meditate, and contemplate on, and then get rid of and say, neti neti. Yes, we have Ken.
Yes, thank you, Shobha, for this wonderful presentation. And I've been enjoying this conversation. On the theme of art and idols, back when I was an undergraduate, I was at Caltech, so in a science school, right, trying to pursue the edges of human knowledge. I had a summer school roommate who was from Thailand. Chesda was his name, Chesna Kivaratnakum. And he had this giant painting he had made. It was like 7 feet tall of Garuda. And we had this in the living room of our apartment all summer long. So I was looking at Garuda. I understand Vishnu and Garuda were paired together, like Shiva and the peacock. But I never did question him at that time with my understanding of images and symbols and idols and going beyond the transcendent, what that pair of Garuda and Vishnu symbolize. You mentioned that Vishnu Sanskrit word indicates the word penetrating everything or permeating everything with the Vish part. And what about Garuda, the large bird?
Well, I think we can go to the voice of the silence for that too, because talks about the Om throughout eternal ages, and the symbol is the Garuda. And so look at the connection between the Vishnu as you know, the pervading spirit, and this connection with the Garuda, which also implies the concept of eternity, you know, if you read I wish I could remember the page. That's why I was looking for my voice, but I can't find it right now when I need it. But talks about it it talks about what the bird symbolizes, each part of the Om, you know, the whole, you know, and it's beautiful because in Sanskrit it's just 2 words. No, this is in Tamil. Tamil, you write it in 2 words. I'm thinking in Tamil. But in Sanskrit, it's just 1 letter with a little dot at the end to signify the you know, and it's just 1 letter with the vowels, because the vowel has the O sound in it, and it symbolizes, and it explains in the footnote what each part of the bird stands for. But then isn't it amazing that Vishnu himself or herself, I mean, itself, what do we want? What pronoun do we use there?
Hmm.
But that whole concept of deity in a manifested form, right? Deity in a manifested form itself shows the aspect of eternity with its vehicle, Garuda.
Mm.
Yes, thank you. I understand also in the symbology, sometimes Garuda is depicted as being on top of the throne where Vishnu is sitting, and sometimes Vishnu is riding on Garuda as they're flying around. So there's this kind of like a change of position, or which one is more prominent in the mind. And this kind of gets to the idea of chanting the 1,000 names, where it's
Right.
like, okay, you have on one hand physical idol, and then on the other hand, you have the transcendental concept. So that could be part of the artistry and the statuary of the two entities there, Vishnu and Garuda being one on top and one on the underneath.
Right.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. That's lovely. Never
Well,
thought
thank you
of
so
that.
much.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
And clearly, as Shobha shared, that passage in the voice speaking about the great bird, the great swan, in and out of time, and it brings to mind, as she pointed out, the statement about motion that she made very earlier on. And also in the SD, HPB said, the great breath is that which exists before space, time, and dimensionality manifest. Once those elements manifest, then we're talking about space and time, hence differentiation of motion, all pervasive as that Vishnu is, and yet that vibration of life itself. And as the Mahatmas talk about motion as the primary differentiating factor of all manifestation, we're being introduced to and invited to explore something that connects that transcendent with that which is immanent, and yet understand something that embraces both those concepts outside of relativity. But I see Jonathan is back. Is our time up, John? Oh, you're muted.
I had a question though.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Maybe we've been talking about this, but it seems like we've been trying to understand this idea. But how would a person? Okay, was it Ibn Arabi that said that if you only think of deity as transcendent, then that's what does it say? The other one is limited.
Yes, that's the first one. Yes. If you affirm only his transcendence, you restrict him. And if you affirm only his eminence,
Yeah.
then you limit him. If you maintain both aspects, you are exempt from error and eminent and a master in the spiritual sciences.
So what would it be? What would it mean to be exempt from error and be a master in the spiritual sciences? In other words, how would you live if you? How would you live that?
I don't know that because I'm not there. However, sorry, I didn't mean to be flippant, but here's what I see in this. If we say we affirm, even in those words, if you say, oh, he's transcendent, how do we see transcendence, right? We've already restricted ourselves. That's why I love the first fundamental where she says it's unspeakable, unthinkable, and then she goes back and tries to help us understand, and she uses symbols, but she knows it's going to be useless, and she ends with the one reality. It's dual aspects in the conditioned universe, right? Gives that. So I think H.P. Blavatsky knows it's, she empathizes with us and sees its part. But she has seen the light, so she knows what she's talking. It's like a teacher trying to teach something in quantum mechanics to a student who is struggling with that concept. And I could name myself as one of them. But the point is, it's that very struggle of trying to understand. You can't say you have that deity is transcendent. What does that mean? What does that mean? Again, if you say, okay, there you are, I can worship you and I adore you, you still limit, right? So what is it saying? It's again coming back to what Eugene always says, neti, neti. It is not this, it is not that. But you can't say what it is. So what's the final symbol we use? We say it's darkness, right? That's the only thing we can use to symbolize it. And then the only other way we understand is motion. There's always motion, but there's darkness because you don't want to put a thing to it. Trying to close our eyes and try to meditate, what are the things that come? Do we see blackness? Do we see blank? No, we don't. At least I don't. I say, what am I going to cook for dinner? Who's there ringing the doorbell? Right? I mean, you have to silence all that before you even focus on the unthinkable, right? So I think what it's trying to tell us is you need to have both within you. And that is the big mystery of how you have both within you, immanence and transcendence. So that's why I started by saying, I don't know. But I can only faintly try to touch the robe of the, the amazing, ineffable, whatever. Try to touch the robe, So
Okay,
that's all.
and thank you again on that one, Shobha. And for Jonathan, I mean, it's something that we've encountered in the Gita. Part of your question, and that is in chapter 18, page 129. An eminent and a master in the spiritual sciences, according to the Gita, is one who is imbued with pure discrimination, restraining him or herself with resolution, having rejected the charms of sound and other objects of the senses, casting off attachment and dislike, dwelling in secluded places, and that can be within one's being as opposed to having one's body separate from humanity, eating little with speech, body, and mind controlled, engaging in constant meditation, because we have to understand that meditation is only a method that also has to be discarded after the time and then becomes a permanent aspect of our being, something to ponder. Abandoning egoism, abandoning arrogance, violence, vanity, desire, anger, pride, and possession with calmness ever present, a man is fitted to be the supreme being with a capital B. And having thus attained to the supreme, he is serene, sorrowing no more desiring, but alike towards all creatures, he attains to supreme devotion to me. By this devotion to me, he knoweth fundamentally who and what I am, and having thus discovered me, he enters into me without any intermediate condition. And even the man who is always engaged in action shall attain by my favor to the eternal and incorruptible, imperishable abode if he puts his trust in me alone. And there's more, but the important piece is that one is still in the world, immanent, outside of the world, transcendent, not attached, not occluded, not obscured, not deluded. And yet, in another chapter, Krishna tells us about that truly boundless condition that's superior to even these. And this is that enters into me without any intermediate condition. And when we can maintain, metaphorically speaking, a balance in those three states, eminent, transcendent, and present, and we understand the very laws that Robert was asking about, how do we deal with those metaphysics, i.e., when we're working as one with karma? Then there is nothing not to do. There is nowhere to go. There is no rest to take because one is beyond birth and death, rest and action. Hence, action in inaction becomes inaction in action, and one is present and fully awake still at the same time. So even though we like to talk about almost the impossibility of these states, the inability of us as limited beings to achieve them, those are thoughts, concepts, and limitations as well. And when we begin to assume responsibility for what we really are, that has to modify our thinking, our action, the way we live, and the responsibilities that we take upon ourselves. David, was your hand up? And then again, Jonathan, you've got to look at the timetable there.
Our time's up technically, but
Oh.
do you want to do another one?
I mean, from what you just read, it's sort of beyond what I was thinking of, which that was great, Gene. But I was thinking of Zen. That's what Zen is all about, trying to get rid of our rational and get into the paradoxical facts of things. What is it? Even the voice of the silence, just the title. What I mean? You can't, right? The sound of one hand clapping. All the Zen koans. That's their purpose is to push us to another level.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. And since Jonathan is telling us we've actually gone over, again, I would assume the right thing to do then is next January 21st, the presentation will deal with the title, That Thou Art. All yours, Jonathan.
Thank you, Gene. Thank you, Shobha. Masterful.
Yes, thank you.
Always
Thank
a
you.
joy. Okay.
Have a good day, Shobha. I know most of it's ahead of you.
All righty. You guys be well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Okay,
Jean.
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you,
namaste.
everybody.
Namaste. Thank you so much.
Namaste. Love you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Love you, Monica. Bye-bye.